So it's really lovely to be speaking after Nick, because what I'm going to talk about was in many ways made possible by his incredibly impressive sort of personal digital archive of New York School little magazines. Towards the end of writing my PhD, I was searching desperately, as one does, for some kind of pithy anecdote that I could open with. That would neatly sum up, my entire argument, which was that women's voices had been ignored and marginalised in New York school scholarship, and that the canon of the school and its relation to gender desperately needed an entirely new approach, a revision in Adrian Rich's terms. And then somewhere I stumbled across a tiny chunk of something called the Poet's Home Companion Handy Poem Writing Guide for Authentic New York School Poets. Which is obviously a delightful and intriguing title. For some reason, I only had the first bit of it, and I still can't remember exactly where I found it. But this is clearly a write-by-numbers template for poems that would resemble the O'Hara-y I do this, I do that style that has come to stand in for the New York School aesthetic as a whole. So I'll just read you this little introductory bit. This handy reference guide gives the basic New York School poem or work in quick, easy-to-use form. Just fill in each blank with one of the suggested words, or follow directions to find your own words. Suggestions are given for both funny and serious poems. And, of course, surrealistic images may also be used for those who like a more traditional flavour. Submit completed works directly to The World, Angel Hair, or the Paris Review. And then it begins, here I am at this time in this place, and in the instructions, this place, is suggested to be classically New York City, occasionally more specific area, i.e. Manhattan, Lower East Side, etc. So this is really recognisable. I found it incredibly funny. And with a bit of digging, I found the full version and found that it had been written by Linda Sheldal and printed in a one-shot memo edited by Carol Gallup called Poet's Home Companion, which was published in 1969. And thanks to Nick, I now have a PDF of the whole magazine, which I'll talk about in a bit. But I just want to hover on Sheldal and Gallup briefly first, because both of those surnames are probably likely to sound familiar. Linda and Carol were married respectively to the art critic Peter Sheldal and the, shall we say, fourth member of what Ashbery termed the soi-disant Tulsa school, Dick Gallup. We can fight about that later. But it's frustrating as a feminist critic to have to locate these women in the history of the New York school in this way, with recourse to their then husbands. It's unfortunately, though, practical, not least because as a British scholar, someone both generationally and geographically detached or removed from the downtown scene into which Poet's Home Companion was published, and this is, by the way, the front cover of Poet's Home Companion, I found it incredibly difficult to find information on these women. I know that they were members of what we might call the second generation, and that we have this great photo of them with Walsh and Waldman and Berrigan and Paget and the Schneemans. Linda is in the middle, Carol to the left, I think. And lots of sort of Paget children. I know that both of them divorced their then husbands, and that Linda Sheldal then returned to her maiden name, O'Brien. And I think, by the way, just a small detour here, that I think I spotted in that very last image you had up of the network of Mother, I think I saw the name Linda O'Brien there. Okay, talk about that later. I found in an April 1967 edition of the Rhode Island Herald, quote, the only English Jewish weekly in Rhode Island and southeast Massachusetts, an article on an installation by the artist Les Levine with this photo captioned, "Lung like walls, Les Levine, creator of disposable rooms, squeezes the lung-like wall in one of his 3 disposable rooms, which went on view last week at the Architectural League. John Margulies looks on as Linda Sheldal tapes another inflatable wall. I know that Linda features in Lewis Warsh's New York Diary 1967 and in Anne Waldman's introduction to the Angel Hair anthology, and that Carol was published in the 1979 magazine Rocky Ledge 2, edited by Waldman and Reed By, still as Carol Gallup. I know that the only mention of Linda in Peter Sheldal's Wikipedia reads, Sheldal married and later divorced a woman whom he publicly referred to as L, with a link to a memoirish piece in the New Yorker called The Art of Dying, in which he's writing about his own cancer diagnosis, and then he writes, L, who is no longer alive, became pregnant on our second date in 1963. A backstreet abortion in Chicago left her sterile. I married her out of guilt mixed with infatuation. She was wild and adored me while sleeping around, as I did too, but I couldn't keep up. We lasted for most of 5 years, possibly because a man I disliked had said that he gave us 3 months. I love Peter Sheldal as an art critic, but that is how I found out that Linda Sheldal / O'Brien died. There is no other reference to that on the internet that I can find. And what I'm getting at here is that I can't find these women. They've disappeared from the history of this scene. And I'm partly bringing this up for sort of literary critical reasons that I'm about to go into, but partly also because I'm bringing it up here because I'm desperate to know more. And so in some ways I'm using this talk as a way of asking for information. If anyone knows anything about Linda O'Brien / Sheldal and Carol Gallup, can you tell me later? Okay, but so what's particularly of interest to me about Linda and Carol? Vaguely trying to avoid using their surnames a bit here. Well, when I first read The Poet's Home Companion, the handy poem writing guide for authentic New York School poems, I thought it was interesting mainly because it was a female poet and a female editor that I hadn't heard of, collaborating in creating something that displayed so obviously a really intimate knowledge of the scene that it's affectionately mocking. It felt like an inside job from people who, according to any narrative that I'd read of that era, were not being positioned as insiders. And then on top of this, it was clear that this was being done specifically through the lens of gender and its relationship to writing and readership. So the title of Gallup's mimeograph, Poet's Home Companion, echoes both Woman's Home Companion, which was published in the US from 1873 to 1957, and Ladies' Home Journal, which is still published and has been in circulation since 1883. And Sheldal's instructions also seem to draw on that kind of twee, gendered style of women's magazines, so using the language of recipes and household articles in order to give tips for best results. And once I had the whole magazine, this became even more apparent. So this is the contents page for Poet's Home Companion. So we have these sections, I don't know how much you can read this, but letters, birthdays, food, fashion, the home, personal, and then of course the classic subversion, pornography. But then back to how to do it for Sheldal's handy poem writing guide. And these contributions are not only written by a sort of really classic lineup of New York School leading lights. You've got Berkson, Schuyler, Waldman, Warsh, Paget. You've got art by Brainard and Schneemann. Although it is also worth noting that there is also Pat Paget here as well as Ron, and Katie Schneemann as well as George. But they're all functioning as part of this parodic imitation of women's magazines. So you have Schuyler in the food section giving recipes supposedly made by the wives of literary figures. It's very funny. And you have fashion, which is just chapter 13 of Apollinaires the Poet Assassinated, as translated by Ron Paget. The personal section is Waldman recording full moons she has known, and also a chunk of her dream journal. So there's this sense that Gallup as an editor is really prodding not just at the marginalization and minority or minoreness of women's reading material, but also, particularly through Sheldahl's piece, prodding at a male-dominated immediate scene around them. I'd love to spend a bit of time thinking about women's labour as part of the mimeograph revolution of this period, but I do want to keep this fairly brief, so that's for another time. Instead, I want to make two kind of final contentions. The first is that I think in some ways the Poet's Home Companion Handy Poem Writing Guide for Authentic New York School Poems is a better benchmark for New York School poetry than the O'Hara poems, or perhaps more pointedly the Berrigan and Paget poems that it parodies. Because it adds in the layer of arch self-awareness and play that O'Hara himself is engaging in when he terms his own work, I do this, I do that poems. Right? I think that term has come to be so well worn in New York School scholarship that we forget that it's O'Hara who coined it. It's in one of his poems. I think that Sheldahl's piece holds within it this sense that poetry as an art form, and perhaps particularly as a pursuit, is simultaneously very serious and very stupid. And my final contention, and perhaps this is the key reason that I'm so interested in this poem, and because I do think of Sheldahl's piece as a poem. My final contention is that one of the most famous poems of the second generation of the New York School is not really written by who we think it was written by. And I'm talking about Ted Berrigan's Red Shift. This is a poem that is referred to by the Poetry Foundation as one of his greatest works, by various critics as a remarkable self-elegy, one of his last major works, dazzling, iconic. And I think all those things are true. I really love this poem. But only in the notes at the back of his collected poems are Sheldahl and Gallup credited, significantly, I think, by Alice Notley. Only there are they credited with what Alice calls the parodic procedure for writing a poem such as one of his own personal poems that Red Shift relies on. He did write this poem because of Linda Sheldahl's piece, which he rediscovered in the 70s. And it does follow her schema. At least, you know, sort of, well, that many words. They all do appear in his poem in that order. He did follow her instructions. Even Red Shift, the title, comes from her instructions. So for me, there's a kind of circular flowchart, if you'll pardon the Ashbury pun, between O'Hara's I do this, I do that poems, the personal poems that Berrigan was already writing, Sheldahl's piece, which draws on both of those things, and then Red Shift. And I think a simplistic understanding of Red Shift seems to point directly back to O'Hara, right? We see this as an O'Hara-esque poem. But that's without considering the way in which Sheldahl, or O'Brien, is the mediator between them. She is the one drawing on O'Hara for Berrigan, if you want. So that's my final hot take. One of the most famous poems of the second generation of the New York School is not the work of a single male genius, but rather, in a very real sense, a collaboration with a woman who has been erased from the history of the school, and who I would like some more help finding out about. Thanks very much.